Now that we understand what organic matter is and how to retain it in our soils and add it effectively to our soils, we can start talking about soil nutrients. I think when we think about managing a farming soil or an organic gardening soil, asking ourselves, how am I going to get the right amount of nutrients in the soil is important. But if you don't know what the nutrients are, it's difficult to figure out how to get them in there. So there's three that are super important because they're needed in the largest amounts by plants, and that is nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. In many different types of blends of composts and things you'll buy at the store, you'll see NPK written on the bag of whether it's a compost or a soil conditioner, things like that. And that stands for nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. I know it's weird, but K is actually the chemical name for potassium because P was already taken by phosphorus. So N, P, K are nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. There are, like I said, a total of 18 necessary nutrients for plants to grow. And if we can't cover them all, we'll at least list them out by the end of this short section on nutrients. So let's talk about nitrogen. Nitrogen is listed first on the bag of compost because it is needed in the largest quantities other than water for plants' growth. And even though our atmosphere is made of 78% nitrogen, it's kind of ironic that it's also one of the hardest things to hold on to in soil. And this is actually true because of its chemical nature. It's very volatile. That means it wants to become a gas and fly back up into space almost constantly. In our soil, it's most easily accessible to plants as a chemical called nitrate. But like I said, as soon as sun hits that bare soil, if you haven't been practicing mindful mulching and covering up your soil with leaves or straw or cut plant material, that NO3 is going to go suddenly back into N2 gas or nitrogen gas and shoot right back up to the atmosphere. So as farmers and gardeners, our job is to help mitigate that nitrogen process and keep it within the soil. These are some of the reasons too that organic matter is so important, because if we have good soil tilth or structure, if we have a good relationship between the clay, silt, and sand in our soil, and we have a 5% organic matter ideal ratio, that's going to provide the perfect holding structure for all that nutrient and for the nitrogen. So large rainstorms, runoff, and different, tilling and things that disturb the soil won't cause it to denitrify so quickly and will help retain it for our plants' growth. Nitrogen is one of the first things to be depleted in our plants' lives, and one way your plant will tell you that it's low on nitrogen is yellowing in the leaves. Now that can happen in a lot of different ways. Yellowing can also be a result of frost burn or even sunburn in plants that are getting too little water. So water levels can also cause yellowing in leaves, and so can some foliar or leaf-based diseases. So it doesn't always mean your plant is low in nitrogen, but poor growth, low fruiting, and low yields, they can all be indicators of low nitrogen in your soils. So if you see any of these things, think about adding more nitrogen-rich things to your soil as you're building the organic matter in that specific part of your garden. So how can you get nitrogen specifically into your soils? Luckily, there's actually quite a lot of ways. All plants contain nitrogen because it's actually a vital component of chlorophyll, which is what makes many plants look green. Nitrogen-based compounds, as a human, are also super important in your blood. So I think about it like that. It's kind of like the plant's blood that keeps them going and keeps all the liquid processes happening evenly within them. So it also helps directly with photosynthesis, which is one of the reasons you'll see the yellowing in the leaves, like I mentioned before, when you have nitrogen deficiency. You can also add manure. Many animal manures are high in nitrogen, and they cause a lot of different chemical reactions to go much more quickly and to be much more available when you use well-composted animal manure, whether it's cow or goat or rabbit or sheep. You can use a wide variety. The only types of animal manures we don't want to use are predator manures like cat or dog. They have a different kind of thing going on, and it's not necessarily the scent olfactory situation that we want to participate in. And also, we don't necessarily know the correct amount of time to compost those types of manures in order to safely add them without risk of disease or parasites to a gardening situation. So I stick to the livestock manures. Things like poultry manure, very high also in other nutrients like phosphorus. So they're great multifaceted additions. And then other manures like rabbit manure or pelleted manures that come from animals like alpacas do not need to be composted and are basically pre-composted by the specialized digestive systems of the animals that produce them. You can also use blood or bone meal, which are slaughterhouse refuse products that you can buy at gardening centers. And they are otherwise parts that would probably go to waste of animals that have died in the food system. So if that is ethically not a problem for you, those are great and usually relatively cheap sources of nitrogen that you can add readily and directly to your garden. So the second letter out of those three, NPK, is the P for phosphorus. Like I said, it gets kind of confusing since potassium and phosphorus both start with a P, but phosphorus is the second most needed nutrient. It's really involved in blooming, rapid growth, in stem growth and things like that, and in fruiting. So these are some of the areas we'll see in our plants kind of suffering if we are low in phosphorus. Because of phosphorus's unique chemical structure, it's most often in the soil as phosphate, PO-4, that it becomes bound up in the soil. So it can be present but chemically unavailable if our soil is unhealthy. Like I mentioned, organic matter levels in the soil aren't just important for water retention and pore spaces. It's also important because it provides chemical reaction sites because of the sizes of particles that are in the soil. So if your phosphate is unavailable in your soils, it could be because of a variety of things like impaction, too much tillage, too much sun. But the cool thing about phosphate is it often doesn't show up as a deficiency until soils have been in production for a few years. This is one thing that makes it different from nitrogen, which in a season can become depleted. It moves much more readily through soil than phosphate does because of its many binding sites with that -4 charge on the molecule. So phosphorus can be retained in the soil and added to the soil in a lot of ways similarly to nitrogen. Bone meal particularly is high in phosphate. You can also buy rock phosphate, which is a mined mineral that is a finite resource that is used as an addition to the soils. And I did say finite. If you've ever seen a phosphate mine, it's really not that different looking than a strip mine. So once again, as farmers, we ask ourselves a lot of ethical questions. I personally don't feel comfortable using rock phosphate. I try instead to use things like bone meal and things that are more readily available. I also use cover crops, manures, and especially chicken manure is high in phosphorus. That's something that's pretty easy to get, and it should be composted at least 6 months, but I like to do mine 8 months to a year until it's crumbly and no longer smells like chicken poop. And this is a good way to know that your compost is ready for application when it kind of just looks like dirt and it no longer resembles the poop it once was. So phosphorus, just like nitrogen, is found in many of the same materials, but is less readily available to move through the soil and can be a limiting factor in fruiting and leaf growth. Sometimes you can tell visually you have a phosphorus deficiency if you see purple spots on the undersides of your leaves. That also could be a variety of diseases, but if you are noticing poor fruit growth, poor flowering, and stunted growth in general, and you see purple spotting, you may have a phosphorus deficiency, so a soil test can answer that question pretty quickly. So finally, we've come to the K, or potassium. Like I said, it's weird, but potassium, its chemical name is K, to help you remember it. And it is the third primary nutrient that plants use in the NPK trifecta. So this one I would say is probably the second most absorbed by volume of the three nutrients. And it's also much more readily movable in the soil than its predecessor phosphorus, which can become trapped in chemical structures, unavailable to plants even though it's present. Potassium is often removed during harvest time in the bodies of the plants that we're removing. So making sure we're replenishing it, luckily, with cover crops, mulching, and manures is super important. Now, where poultry manure is really high in phosphorus, it's actually low in potassium. But there are some other amendments we can add, like green sand, which is a purchasable, also I would say finite resource, but because it doesn't need to be blown up out of mountains, you can buy smaller amounts of it in a more sustainable fashion. You can also use the wood ashes from your wood stove. Wood ashes are a really great, basically free resource for potassium in soils. And it's really interesting to notice that there's a lot of controversy about putting wood ashes in your garden. I personally use them in my garden And I think a lot of the controversy comes from how much you put in. Other things like granite dust and green sand are also great additions for potassium in soils, but you have to buy those things. So being a cheap young person, millennial with little disposable income and a high desire to grow a lot of food, I use wood ashes a lot. The thing that I like to do is sprinkle them very thinly over a space before I add compost in the garden. Or my other favorite thing to do is mix them with compost that is well rotted and then apply it. It has a liming effect, which means it makes a soil more basic. So it can be really helpful. Most composts are naturally quite acidic to add a little bit to your compost. Or if you have a very basic soil, it is also worthy of noting maybe you don't want to add wood ashes to your soil and might want to find a different way to add phosphorus and potassium than using wood ash. In old books, you'll see it written as potash sometimes when people talk about adding this specific substance or charred wood or things like that to their soils. They'll say this is the percent potash in a soil. And I think of it like that because wood ashes historically, from if you've read about biochar before, have been used for thousands of years as a soil amendment. So potassium can show up as bronzing in plants, where the leaves look almost like they're turning a kind of goldeny brown, purpley yellow color, which I think is best described by the color bronze. And they can also curl and even get orange spots on them sometimes. Once again, it's very hard visually to tell sometimes what is wrong with our plants unless you get super familiar with your region's particular diseases and soil problems. But if you see that happening on your plants, it is definitely worth a soil test, once again, to determine if low potassium is your problem. So if NPK are the primary nutrients, sulfur, calcium, and magnesium are the secondary nutrients. They are also needed in high levels for flowering, fruiting, rapid growth, reproduction, and a lot of other really important processes in our plants. So making sure we have adequate amounts of them in our soils is also really important. Here where we live, magnesium levels are historically low in Western North Carolina, but they have mitigated this by adding magnesium and calcium as well to lime products. I mentioned in the potassium section that liming effects are when we cause soil to become more basic. You can buy lime, which is made from limestone, and has things, if it's called dolomitic lime, has magnesium and calcium added. This way, you know you're getting enough calcium and magnesium in areas that are deficient. The best way to figure that out is to get a soil test. Unfortunately, like I said, it does cost money usually to test your soil, but they do offer at-home kits that are pretty cheap that will let you test some of the nutrients, but not all of them. It will also let you test your pH. And like I said, pH is really important in soil because that's what's determining if chemical reactions can occur, which ones, and how efficiently. So to get calcium, sulfur, and magnesium in our soils, we're going to need to add that dolomitic lime. You can also add animal bones, bone meal, and with sulfur, it will naturally occur in the decomposition processes of cover cropping and composting. So there are different ways to make sure you get all of them in there. Calcium is especially important in flowering and fruiting, and so you can sometimes notice a deficiency of calcium after many years of gardening in the same place by having issues with flowering and fruiting in your different crops. So pay close attention to those things to make sure you're not having either a potassium or calcium deficiency. So after secondary nutrients, you also have micronutrients. And these, it's really easy to remember because of their name, micronutrients are only needed in micro doses for plants to be healthy. And these are copper, boron, molybdenum, manganese, zinc, and there's a couple other things that can also be involved in that 18 required minerals and nutrients profiles that plants need to survive. But those are the most important ones in my opinion. And the cool thing is they can kind of be recycled by adding things like grass clippings, cover crops, parts of plants we're not eating that are not diseased back into our compost. You can basically keep a closed loop system, meaning you're not taking every bit of nutrients out of your soil when you harvest a plant by adding those other parts back to our composts and back to our soils. Manures, cover crops, leaf mulch, and other parts like that we're using to degrade into organic matter in our compost piles, those also contain micronutrients. And we can also use things like kelp meals and fish emulsion, which is pretty stinky, but very effective at adding micronutrients to our soils. Compost teas like comfrey leaf tea and manure teas, which is basically soaking a bag of manure in aerated water. It's a little yucky sounding, but it's extremely helpful for the garden. You can also soak leaf mulch in water and add that mineral-rich, basically micronutrient-rich water to your garden as well. And it's a little less stinky than manure tea, but sometimes in hot weather, not that different. So there's a lot of different ways to keep micronutrients cycling through our soils, and those are just a few of them. And like with everything, it all comes back to, if we can manage organic matter in our soil, we can naturally manage the NPK, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, the magnesium, sulfur, and calcium, the secondary nutrients, and all of the micronutrients that we need for our plants to thrive and be healthy.